Didn't look at my brother when he walked in. I kept my eyes on the grain of the wood table, the long conference table that had been in our family's company boardroom for 30 years. The one my father used to drum his fingers on when he was thinking. I knew that table. I had done homework at that table when I was 9 years old, waiting for my dad to finish a call so he could take me to get ice cream. I had not been invited to this meeting. I found out about it the same way I found out about most things my brother did, through someone else, a paralegal named Julie, who had worked at the company for 11 years and still remembered when I used to bring my dad lunch on Fridays, sent me a one-line text the evening before. Board meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m., special session. You should know. That was all she wrote. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time after that. His name is Connor. He's 4 years older than me, and for most of my life I believed that the distance between us was just the normal kind, the kind that comes from being different people who happen to share a last name and a childhood bedroom wall. He liked football. I liked books. He stayed close to home after college. I left because I had to. That is the part of the story that my family never quite understood, or maybe never wanted to. When I was 22, I was recruited by a federal financial crimes unit that I am still not entirely free to describe in detail. What I can tell you is that the work was real, the hours were brutal, and the reason my name does not appear on any public-facing document from that period of my life is not because I was hiding. It is because that was the requirement of the job. To my family, I disappeared. To my father, for the last 5 years of his life, I was the daughter who chose a city over him. He said that to me once, standing in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, the week before Thanksgiving. You chose a city over your family. I wanted to explain. I wanted to say, Dad, I chose a country. I chose something larger than any of us. But I had signed documents that made explanation impossible, and so I stood there and took it. And I ate turkey with people who thought they knew me, and I drove back to my apartment on Sunday night with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been performing a version of herself for 4 straight days. He died in February 18 months ago now. He left the company to both of us, 50% each. That was in the will. The company was a regional freight logistics firm our grandfather had started in 1971, and it was not glamorous, but it was solid. 48 employees, good relationships with clients who had been with us for decades. My father had kept it conservative and careful, and it had survived things that flashier companies had not. My 50% was supposed to mean something. What it actually meant, I discovered, was that Connor had spent the better part of the past year treating it like a technicality. He had been making decisions without me, capital expenditure decisions, a contract renegotiation with our biggest client that I was not consulted on, a refinancing arrangement that I only learned about when I noticed the quarterly statements looked different. Every time I raised a concern, he had an answer ready. You're never here, Lee. You don't understand the day-to-day. You've been gone for years. Let the people who actually showed up run the business. Lee is my name. It is short for nothing. My mother just liked it. I tried to do things the right way. I requested a formal review of the financials. I hired my own accountant, a woman I had worked with indirectly through a contact from my federal years, someone I trusted completely. Her name is Suzanne. And she is the kind of person who finds irregularities the way other people find loose change, effortlessly, constantly, with a mild expression that does not change even when what she is looking at is genuinely alarming. Suzanne spent 3 weeks with the books. When she came back to me, she sat across from my kitchen table with a coffee she had not touched, and a folder she set down very carefully, the way you set down something you are treating with respect, and she said, Lee, your brother has been redirecting margin from 2 of your top 4 accounts into a subsidiary LLC that you are not a named partner in. It has been happening for at least 22 months. I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming. I remember looking at the folder and not picking it up right away. 22 months. He had started 4 months after our father's funeral. I had a decision to make. I could go to him directly, give him the chance to explain, to return what he had taken, to agree to a restructuring that protected both of us and the 48 employees who had nothing to do with any of this. I drafted the email 3 times. I deleted it 3 times. The 4th time I talked to Suzanne, she said something I have thought about since. The thing about someone who does this quietly for almost 2 years, she said, is that they have already decided what kind of person they are. You are not going to surprise them into becoming someone different. So I went to an attorney instead. Her name is Deborah, and she is 61 years old, and she has the energy of someone who has spent 4 decades being underestimated and found it largely useful. She listened to everything I said without interrupting. She looked at Suzanne's documentation. She asked 4 questions, all of them precise, none of them rhetorical. Then she said, "We're going to file for a formal shareholder derivative action and request an emergency board review. I want everything preserved before he has a chance to restructure anything." That was 6 weeks before Julie texted me. The morning of the board meeting, I wore a grey blazer I had owned since I was 26. I had worn it to 3 federal debriefs and 1 funeral. It fit the same way it always had, which I found mildly reassuring. I arrived before Connor did. The 3 independent board members, 2 of whom had known my father for decades, 1 who had joined more recently, were already seated. They looked at me with the particular expression of people who are professionally neutral but personally uncomfortable. I had seen that expression before. It was the expression of someone who has been told something and is waiting to find out if it is true. I sat down. I folded my hands on the table. Connor came in 7 minutes late. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked something closer to annoyed, which told me that he had expected to deal with the possibility of my presence and had decided it would not change anything. He set his bag down at the head of the table, my father's seat, which neither of us had ever officially claimed, and he looked at me for a moment before he sat. "I didn't know you were going to be here," he said. "I'm a 50% shareholder," I said. "I received proper notice." "You received notice from a paralegal who had no authority to." "I received notice, Connor." He looked at the board. He adjusted his posture. He had a presentation prepared. I knew this because I could see the corner of a printed slide deck peeking out from the folder he'd brought. The kind my father used to make fun of. Too many colors, not enough numbers. The presentation, as far as I could tell in the first few minutes, was a case for diluting my share of the company through a new capital raise structure that would require existing shareholders to either invest additional funds or accept a reduced percentage. The investment threshold was set at a number he had to know I could not meet, given that I had spent the last decade working for the federal government rather than accumulating private capital. It was, I realized as he talked, actually elegant. It would have worked if no one had looked closely. It would have looked like a legitimate business decision. He would have ended up with effective control of a company our grandfather built, and I would have walked away with a smaller piece of something that had already been quietly hollowed out. The board members listened. One of them, the newer one, a man named Philip who had been brought on during the refinancing Connor arranged, asked questions that sounded like challenges but landed softly. I had done some background on Philip in the weeks before this meeting. He and Connor had been at the same golf fundraiser 4 times in the past 18 months. When Connor finished, he looked at me with an expression I can only describe as final. "Like a door closing. Lay," he said. And his voice had that particular tone he had used since we were children when he wanted to sound reasonable at the expense of someone else. "I think you know that you haven't been present in this company. You haven't been present in this family." Dad felt that. We all felt it. This restructuring is about protecting what he built. I don't think that's something you've ever really understood. The room was quiet. One of the older board members, a man named Arthur, who had worked with my father since 1994, looked down at the table. I let the silence sit for a moment. I have learned over years of work that required me to stay composed when the pressure in a room was designed to make me react, that silence is not emptiness. Silence is pressure applied in a different direction. Then I said, "May I present some materials?" Deborah had prepared 2 sets of documents. The first was Suzanne's financial analysis, clean, sourced, annotated. The kind of document that does not leave interpretive room. The second was something I had spent 6 weeks working to obtain through channels I still have limited ability to discuss fully, but which my former supervisors had ultimately agreed to release in a form suitable for a civil proceeding. It was a letter. On federal letterhead, summarizing, in the broadest terms that security protocols permitted, the nature of the work I had performed over the previous 9 years. It did not list case names. It did not list locations. It did not list locations. It did not list outcomes. What it did confirm, clearly and without qualification, was my employment status, my role in financial investigation work of a sensitive national nature, and my security clearance level at the time of my separation from the unit. It was signed by someone whose name I will not include here, but whose title, which I am permitted to share, was Deputy Director, Financial Crimes Enforcement Division. I slid one copy across the table to the board members. I placed one copy in front of Connor. I watched him pick it up. I had imagined this moment in the abstract many times over the past weeks. I had not imagined how quiet the room would get. Not tense quiet. The earlier silence had been tense. This was a different kind. This was the quiet of people recalibrating, of people who have been holding a picture in their heads and are being handed a completely different photograph. Connor read it. He read it again. I could see his eyes moving. Arthur reached over and picked up his copy. He read the first paragraph. He set it down. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen directed at me in a very long time. Something between recognition and something I might call grief. Not for anything lost right now, but for years of wrong assumptions that couldn't be taken back. Lay, he said, and he said it differently than Connor had. I'm aware this is unusual, I said. I want to be clear that I'm presenting this not as a personal defense, but as context for understanding why certain financial irregularities in this company were not identified sooner. The person most qualified to recognize what was happening in these accounts was someone who had been spending 9 years doing exactly this kind of work at a federal level and who was not given access to the books until recently. Deborah, who was seated to my left and had not yet spoken, placed Suzanne's financial report in front of each board member. The figures in Section 3, she said. Document 22 months of margin redirection totaling approximately $340,000 from 2 key accounts into a subsidiary LLC structured to appear as a vendor relationship. The documentation trail and its absence in certain required disclosures is detailed on pages 9 through 14. Philip looked at Connor. Connor had put the federal letter down. His hands were flat on the table. This is... He started. You have the same documents I have, I said. There's nothing on those pages that isn't sourced. Arthur spoke quietly to the 2 other independent board members. Not in a whisper, just in the measured, low-register voice of someone who has handled serious things before and knows that performance doesn't help. After a moment, he looked at Philip. I think we need to table the capital restructuring proposal, Arthur said. And I think we need to discuss the appropriate next steps given what's been presented. Philip opened his mouth. Closed it. I'd like to note, Deborah said, addressing the board, that my client is not at this time seeking criminal referral. She is seeking remediation, full financial restoration, a restructuring of governance to require joint approval on all capital decisions above a defined threshold, and a formal review of the subsidiary LLC in question. We believe these are proportionate and reasonable steps that prioritize the stability of the company and its employees. I looked at Connor when she said employees. That was deliberate. 48 people had jobs that depended on this company not becoming a protracted legal war. I wanted him to hear that I had thought about them. He was looking at the table. He looked, in that moment, smaller than he had ever looked to me. And this was a man I had watched throw touchdown passes at a homecoming game. A man who had the particular confidence of someone who had always been told by their surroundings that they were exactly the right size for every room they entered. He looked like someone who had finally walked into a room where that was not true. I did not feel triumphant. That is the part that surprised me. I had expected, after months of this, the financial discovery, The attorney consultations, the careful documentation, the restraint, to feel something bright and sharp when it finally came apart. Instead, I felt tired. The particular tiredness of someone who has spent a long time holding a shape that is not their natural one. The meeting ended without a vote on the restructuring. The board voted 3-1 to commission an independent financial audit and to implement a temporary governance freeze on major capital decisions pending the audit's completion. Philip voted against. I noted that. Connor left without speaking to me. He walked past me on the way to the door, and for just a moment he slowed, and I thought he was going to say something. He didn't. His attorney called Deborah 4 days later. The settlement took 11 weeks to finalize. I am not able to share all of the terms. What I can tell you is that the $340,000 was returned to the company, not to me personally. It went back into the business, back toward the 48 people who showed up every day. A new governance structure was put in place requiring joint approval on any expenditure above $25,000. The subsidiary LLC was dissolved. Connor retained his 50%, I kept mine. I drove home the afternoon the settlement documents were signed, and I sat in my car in the parking garage for a few minutes before starting the engine. I had a text from Suzanne that said simply, "Done. Good." I had one from Deborah that said, "Call me next week, not urgent." I had one from Julie, the paralegal, that said, "I heard. I'm glad." I thought about my father. I thought about the kitchen and what he had said. "You chose a city over your family." I had wanted for years to explain that. To sit across from him and say, I was doing something that mattered. I was doing the work. I was building something even if you couldn't see it. Even if my name wasn't on anything. Even if I couldn't answer your questions at Thanksgiving or come home for every birthday or be the version of a daughter that looked like what you expected a daughter to look like. I never got to have that conversation with him. That is the part of all of this that no settlement fixes. But I thought about what Suzanne had said, the thing about someone who does this quietly for almost 2 years, and I thought about the version of me who might have deleted that 4th email and let it go. Who might have decided that fighting was too expensive, too disruptive, too much. Who might have walked away with a smaller piece of something already hollowed out and told herself it was the reasonable choice. I thought about 48 people clocking in on a Monday morning, not knowing that the place they worked had been quietly drained for almost 2 years. Not knowing that someone had fought to put it back. I thought about my grandfather, who had started a freight company in 1971 with 1 truck, and a list of clients he kept in a paper ledger. I put the car in drive. There is one more thing. 3 months after the settlement, Arthur called me. Not about business, just to talk. He had been on that board for nearly 30 years. He had known my father when my father was younger than I am now. We talked for about an hour, which surprised both of us, I think. Near the end of the call, he said, "I want to apologize for not asking more questions. About where you were, what you were doing. Your father used to say he didn't understand your choices, and I never pushed back on that. I should have. I told him he didn't owe me an apology. He said, maybe not. But I wanted you to have it anyway. I kept my grandfather's freight company. I kept all 48 employees. I kept my 50%. And sometimes when I am in that boardroom and I run my fingers along the edge of that long table, I think about my father drumming his fingers on it when he was thinking. And I think, I was always here. You just didn't know where to look." I keep coming back to the moment Connor put that federal letter down on the table, not the moment the board voted, not the moment the settlement was signed, that specific moment, his hands going flat, his face going still. Because that was when I understood something I had been circling around for years without quite landing on it. What he took wasn't really money. It was the assumption that I wouldn't know, that I wouldn't look, that the version of me he had decided on, absent, disconnected, not serious, was accurate enough to bet on. He was wrong about that. And the reason he was wrong wasn't luck. It was a chain of choices, most of them quiet, most of them made when no one was watching. I think about Suzanne sitting across my kitchen table with an untouched coffee and a folder she set down carefully. She is one of the most honest people I know. Not in the easy way, where honesty costs nothing, but in the way that costs something every time. She could have told me the books looked fine. It would have been simpler. Instead, she told me the truth, precisely and without drama. Because that is what integrity actually looks like when it isn't performing for an audience. There was no applause for that conversation. There was just a woman who decided long ago that she was going to do her work right regardless of what it required. I think about Deborah, who listened to everything and asked 4 questions and didn't waste a single word. The kind of clarity she brought to this. The ability to look at a complicated situation and identify exactly what mattered and what didn't. That is not instinct. That is decades of disciplined thinking. It is what happens when someone refuses to let their mind go soft. When they keep sharpening their judgment, even when it would be easier to rely on what they already know. I want to be that kind of thinker. I am working on it. And I think about myself. In the months between Suzanne's folder and that boardroom, I drafted that email 4 times. I wanted the easier path. I wanted to believe there was a version of this where I could appeal to something decent in my brother and not have to fight. But there wasn't, and I knew it, and eventually I stopped pretending otherwise. Getting up from that and doing the harder thing anyway. Not because I was certain it would work, but because walking away would have been a different kind of wrong. That is the part I am most quietly proud of. My father thought I had chosen distance. What I had actually chosen was a kind of work that required me to disappear, and I had done it without complaint, and I had come back anyway when the thing I loved needed defending. I didn't do it to prove something to him. He was gone. I did it because 48 people had jobs. Because my grandfather had built something real. Because the truth was in those pages, and the truth deserved to be said out loud in that room, and someone had to be the one to say it. Actions accumulate. The corners you cut come back. The work you do quietly, with integrity, with rigor, with the willingness to stay when staying is hard, that accumulates too. I put the car in drive. That is the whole lesson, really. You put the car in drive.